The morning began like many others for the quiet mechanic. The small repair garage sat beside a dusty road at the edge of town, where old pickup trucks and worn-out sedans often lined up before the sun fully rose. The smell of oil and metal filled the air every day, and the sound of tools hitting steel was as normal as the sound of birds in morning. He arrived early, just like he always did. The sky was still pale gray when he pushed open the metal door and stepped inside. His toolbox sat in the same corner where he had kept it for years. The tools were old but carefully cleaned, every wrench and screwdriver placed exactly where it belonged. He believed that if a person respected his tools, the tools would respect the work. He tied his faded work apron and began checking the vehicles waiting for repair. Some needed simple fixes. Others needed patience and careful attention. That was something he was known for. He did not rush his work, and he rarely made mistakes. But the truth was that most people at the garage did not notice his effort. To them, he was just another mechanic who kept his head down and spoke very little. His mind, however, was not fully on the cars that morning. Before leaving home, he had packed a small lunch for his young child and walked him to school. Being a single father meant that every day was a careful balance between work and family. There was no one else to help with school mornings, homework, or doctor visits. Still, he never complained. The child was the most important part of his life. Every late shift and every extra repair job was for one reason only, to make sure the child had a stable future. Around mid-morning, the garage grew busy. A few regular customers arrived, and engines began roaring as workers tested repaired vehicles. The owner of the garage walked around with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching mechanics. He was known for having a short temper and speaking loudly whenever something went wrong. Not long after, a shiny black SUV pulled into garage. It was far newer and more expensive than most cars that came through the shop. The vehicle stopped suddenly, and a well-dressed man stepped out, looking irritated. The owner immediately rushed over, smiling politely. The customer spoke quickly and angrily, pointing at the engine. He said the car had been repaired at this garage 2 days earlier, but now something felt wrong again. The engine made a strange noise while driving. The owner listened carefully and nodded. Then he called out to the mechanic. The quiet single father walked over, wiping his hands on a cloth. The owner asked if he had worked on the SUV earlier in the week. He nodded calmly and explained that he had replaced a worn part in the engine system. The repair had been simple, and he had tested the car before returning it to the customer. The customer interrupted before he could finish explaining. The man said the vehicle still sounded wrong, and that he did not trust the repair. The owner's expression quickly changed. Instead of calmly checking the problem, he suddenly turned toward the mechanic with an angry look. "Did you rush the job?" the owner demanded loudly. The mechanic shook his head and began explaining that every step had been done correctly. He even offered to check the engine again to see what the issue might be. But the owner was already irritated. Other workers had stopped what they were doing and were quietly watching. Even a few customers waiting in the lobby were now paying attention. The owner raised his voice again. "You always say everything is done right," he said sharply. But now the customer is back with the same problem. The mechanic tried once more to explain that sometimes a new sound could come from a different part of the engine. It might not even be related to the repair he had done. The owner did not want to hear it. In front of everyone, he began blaming the mechanic for careless work. The words were harsh and humiliating. He accused him of being slow, careless, and not paying attention. The mechanic stood quietly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Embarrassment slowly burned inside his chest, but he kept his voice calm. He simply said he would inspect the vehicle again and fix whatever the issue was. But the owner's anger had already grown too large. "Enough!" the owner snapped. He pointed toward the mechanic's toolbox. "You're done here." For a moment, the garage became completely silent. Some of the other mechanics looked down at the floor. A few of them knew the quiet man worked harder than most people there, but none of them spoke. The mechanic blinked slowly, making sure he had heard correctly. The owner crossed his arms. "You heard me," he said coldly. "Pack your tools and leave. I can't keep someone here who embarrasses my shop." The words hit harder than any shouted insult. Years of work in that garage had ended in a few seconds. The mechanic did not argue. He did not raise his voice or try to defend himself again. Instead, he walked slowly back to his corner of the shop. He opened his toolbox and began placing each tool carefully inside. The same tools he had used to fix hundreds of vehicles now felt heavier than usual. Around him, the sounds of the garage slowly returned. Engines started again. Metal clanged against metal, but the air felt different. One of the younger workers glanced toward him with sympathy, but said nothing. Within a few minutes, the toolbox was closed. The mechanic lifted it and walked toward the exit. As he passed the owner, the man was already speaking politely to the wealthy customer again, promising to personally handle the repair. The mechanic stepped outside into the sunlight. For a moment, he simply stood there beside the dusty road. The world felt strangely quiet. Losing the job meant more than just losing a paycheck. Rent was due soon. School supplies were needed. The child depended completely on him. He took a slow breath and began walking home. The road felt longer than usual. While walking, he thought about the moment inside the garage. The anger, the humiliation, the silence of the other workers. But more than anything, he thought about the child waiting at school, expecting everything to be normal. By the time he reached home, the afternoon sun was already lowering in the sky. The small house was simple but clean. Toys sat neatly in one corner of the living room. A small drawing hung on the wall, made by the child with colorful crayons. He placed the toolbox near the door and sat quietly at the kitchen table. For several minutes, he stared at the surface of the table without speaking. Then he stood up and began preparing dinner, just like every other day. Later that afternoon, he walked to the school to pick up the child. The child ran toward him with a smile, talking excitedly about something that had happened in class. He listened carefully, smiling back, hiding the weight on his shoulders. That evening they ate dinner together and talked about homework and school stories. The child never noticed anything unusual. But long after the house became quiet and the child had fallen asleep, the mechanic sat alone at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands that had repaired engines, fixed broken machines, and worked countless hours. Now those same hands had no work waiting for them the next morning. Outside, the night air was calm. In the distance, far beyond the small town, a faint sound of helicopter blades passed through the sky for a brief moment before disappearing again. The mechanic did not hear it. He simply sat in silence, wondering how he would start again. What he did not know was that the next day would bring something no one at the garage, or even in the entire town, could have imagined. The next morning felt heavier than usual. The quiet mechanic woke up early, even though there was no job waiting for him anymore. For years his body had followed the same routine. Wake up before sunrise, prepare breakfast, walk the child to school, and then head straight to the garage. Now the routine felt strange. He stood in the small kitchen making breakfast while the child sat at the table, talking about school and a drawing project that the class would be working on later that day. The child's voice was cheerful and full of energy, completely unaware of the difficult situation that had appeared overnight. He listened carefully and nodded, smiling when the child showed him a notebook filled with colorful sketches. In that moment, he pushed his worries aside. The child deserved a peaceful morning, not a house filled with stress. After breakfast, he walked the child to school like always. The morning air was cool, and the streets were slowly filling with people heading to work. Parents waved goodbye to their children, and small groups of students laughed while walking to the school gate. Before leaving, the child hugged him tightly and ran inside. He stood there for a moment watching the school building. Then he turned and began walking back home, wondering what the rest of the day would look like. Back at the small house, he opened his toolbox and began cleaning his tools again. It was something he did whenever he needed to think. Each wrench and socket was wiped carefully before being placed back into its slot. His mind searched for possible work. Maybe another repair shop in town needed help. Maybe someone would hire him for small repairs. But he knew jobs were not easy to find. Hours passed quietly. Meanwhile, across town, the repair garage was already busy again. The same vehicles filled the parking area, and the same sound of engines echoed through the building. Inside, the owner was still dealing with the expensive SUV from the day before. The vehicle sat with its hood open while two mechanics tried to figure out the strange noise. They checked the same part that had been repaired earlier, but everything looked perfectly fine. The owner frowned as he watched them struggle. After nearly an hour, one mechanic stepped back and scratched his head. "I don't see anything wrong here," he admitted. The other mechanic agreed. The repair seemed solid. The owner's frustration grew, but he said nothing. Instead, he told them to keep looking. Just then, a deep rumbling sound began to echo across the town. At first it was distant, like thunder rolling far away. But within seconds the noise became louder and louder. People outside began looking up at the sky. A large helicopter appeared over the rooftops, its blades spinning powerfully as it circled above the town. Inside the garage, workers stopped what they were doing. "That's not a news helicopter," one mechanic said quietly. The aircraft looked large and powerful, painted in dark military colors. The helicopter slowly descended toward an open field near the road, not far from the garage. Dust and dry grass flew into the air as it landed. Curious residents began gathering nearby, pointing and whispering. Back inside the garage, the workers stepped outside to watch. The owner folded his arms, staring at the unexpected sight. Moments later, the helicopter doors opened. Several uniformed Navy personnel stepped out onto the field. Their movements were calm and organized. One of them carried a small folder, while another spoke into a radio. People in the crowd began wondering what had brought the military to their quiet town. After a brief conversation among themselves, two of the officers began walking toward the repair garage. The workers watched them approach. The owner straightened his shirt and stepped forward as the officers entered the building. "Good morning," one of the officers said politely. His voice was calm but firm. The owner nodded nervously. "Can I help you?" The officer opened a small folder in his hands and looked at a sheet of paper. "We're looking for a mechanic who worked here recently," he said. The owner blinked in confusion. "A mechanic?" The officer nodded. "Yes. We were told he worked in this garage for several years." The owner scratched his head. The situation felt strange. "What's his name?" he asked. The officer glanced down at the paper again before speaking. The moment the owner heard the name, his expression changed slightly. "That mechanic?" he said. The officer watched him carefully. "Yes. Do you know where we can find him?" The owner hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, he worked here until yesterday." The officers exchanged a brief look. "Until yesterday?" one of them repeated. The owner cleared his throat. "Yes, I had to let him go." The garage suddenly felt very quiet again. Several workers stood nearby, pretending to continue their tasks while listening closely. The officer spoke again. "Do you know where he lives?" The owner nodded slowly and pointed toward the road leading out of town. "He lives about 15 minutes from here." The officer thanked him politely. Then the Navy personnel turned and walked back toward the helicopter. As they left, the workers began whispering among themselves. "Why would the Navy be looking for him?" one mechanic asked. Another shrugged. "Maybe he fixed a car for someone important." The owner remained silent, watching the officers climb back into the helicopter. Moments later, the powerful machine lifted off the ground again, sending another wave of dust across the field. Instead of leaving town, however, the helicopter turned and flew toward the direction of the small neighborhood where the mechanic lived. Back at the house, the mechanic was still sitting at the table looking through a small notebook where he kept records of repairs he had done over the years. Suddenly, a distant sound reached his ears. At first, he ignored it, but the noise quickly grew louder. The windows began to vibrate slightly as the sound of helicopter blades filled the air. He stepped outside and looked up. The large aircraft was descending slowly toward the open area near the houses. Neighbors began stepping outside their homes, shielding their eyes from the sunlight while staring at the helicopter. The machine landed carefully in a nearby empty lot. Dust swirled around as the blades slowed down. The mechanic watched quietly, unsure what was happening. Then the helicopter door opened. Two Navy officers stepped out and walked directly toward him. People in the neighborhood whispered among themselves, surprised to see uniformed officers walking through their quiet street. The mechanic stood still as the officers approached. When they reached him, both of them greeted him with respect. "Oli," "Good morning," one officer said. The mechanic nodded. "Good morning." The officer studied his face for a moment before speaking again. "We've been looking for you." The mechanic's expression remained calm, but curious. "For me?" The officer nodded. "Yes." He opened a folder and showed him a document. "We believe you're the only person who can help us with a very serious mechanical problem." The mechanic looked at the paper, but did not speak. The officer continued. "One of our aircraft is grounded because of a complex technical failure. Our engineers have been unable to solve it." The neighbors nearby were now listening carefully. The officer closed the folder. "Someone remembered your work from years ago," he said, "and they insisted we find you." The mechanic stood quietly, absorbing the unexpected words. Behind him, the child's small bicycle rested near the front door. The officer glanced at the house and then back at him. "We understand this request may come suddenly," he said respectfully, "but the situation is urgent." The helicopter blades began spinning again slowly as the pilot prepared for departure. The officer gestured toward the aircraft. "If you're willing to help, we'd like you to come with us." The mechanic looked toward the helicopter. Then he looked at the curious faces of his neighbors. And finally, he looked back at the officer. In that moment, the quiet man who had been humiliated and fired the day before realized that his ordinary life was about to take a very unexpected turn. For a few seconds, the mechanic did not say anything. The sound of the helicopter blades slowly turned behind the officers filled the air, and dust moved gently across the empty lot. Neighbors stood at a distance, whispering to each other, trying to understand why Navy officers had come looking for the quiet man who lived in the small house. The mechanic looked at the officers calmly. Their uniforms were neat, and their expressions were serious but respectful. One of the officers spoke again. "We know this is unexpected," he said, "but we were hoping you could come with us for a short time." The mechanic glanced back toward his house. His thoughts immediately went to his child, who would return from school later that afternoon. "I have a child," he said quietly. "I need to pick them up from school." The officer nodded immediately, as if he had expected that answer. "We understand," he replied. "We can bring you back before school ends. Or, if you prefer, we can arrange transportation to make sure everything is handled." The mechanic studied the officer's face for a moment. There was no pressure in his voice, only respect. He took a slow breath. "I can come," he finally said. The officer gave a small nod and signaled toward the helicopter. Neighbors watched in silence as the mechanic walked toward the aircraft with the officers. Some people recognized him from a neighborhood, but had never imagined something like this happening. One older neighbor shook his head in disbelief. "Isn't he the man who fixes cars?" he whispered. Another neighbor nodded slowly. "Yes, quiet man, keeps to himself." The mechanic climbed into the helicopter and sat down beside the officers. The inside of the aircraft was filled with equipment and seats along the walls. The pilot gave a quick signal, and the blades began spinning faster. Within seconds, a helicopter lifted off the ground, rising above the houses and trees of the small neighborhood. From the window, the mechanic could see the town shrinking below. For a moment, he simply watched the roads and rooftops pass beneath them. One of the officers sat across from him. "Thank you for agreeing to come," the officer said. The mechanic nodded slightly. "I'm still not sure why you need me." The officer opened the folder again and pulled out a photograph. It showed a military helicopter sitting inside a large hangar. "This aircraft has a serious mechanical issue," the officer explained. "Our engineers have tried several solutions, but the problem keeps returning." He handed the photo to the mechanic. "The failure is happening deep inside the transmission system. The vibration patterns are unusual." The mechanic looked at the image carefully. His eyes moved slowly across the photograph, studying the details. The officer continued speaking. "During our search for solutions, one of our senior technicians mentioned something interesting. Years ago, someone solved a nearly identical problem during a training operation." The mechanic remained quiet. The officer leaned forward slightly. "That technician was you." For a moment, the cabin was silent, except for the steady hum of the engine. The mechanic finally looked up from the photo. "That was a long time ago," he said. The officer smiled faintly. "Yes, but the records say the solution you created prevented a very serious failure." The mechanic leaned back in his seat. Memories from many years earlier began returning slowly. Before he'd become a mechanic in a small garage, his life had been very different. He had once worked with complex aircraft systems, long hours inside massive hangars, surrounded by engineers and technicians, machines that required careful thinking and steady hands. Back then, he had loved the work. The officer seemed to sense his thoughts. "You left the service unexpectedly," he said gently. The mechanic looked down for a moment. "My wife became very sick," he explained quietly. The officer nodded with understanding. "Yes, we read about that." There was no judgment in his voice. "When she passed away, I had a child to raise," the mechanic continued. "I needed a stable life, something closer to home." The officer listened respectfully. "So you chose a garage," he said. The mechanic gave a small nod. It was honest work. The helicopter continued flying across open land. Fields and small towns passed beneath them. After nearly 30 minutes, a large military facility appeared ahead. Tall fences surrounded several enormous hangars, and multiple aircraft were visible on the ground. The helicopter slowly descended toward one of the open areas. As soon as it landed, several technicians approached the aircraft. The mechanic stepped out and looked around. The place was much larger than the garage where he had been working the day before. Inside one of the hangars sat the helicopter from the photograph. Several engineers stood nearby, studying computer screens and mechanical parts spread across tables. One of the senior technicians walked forward quickly when he saw the arriving group. When his eyes landed on the mechanic, his expression brightened with recognition. "I knew it," the technician said with a relieved smile. "It really is you." The mechanic looked at him for a moment before recognition appeared on his face as well. They had worked together many years ago. The technician shook his hand warmly. "I told them you were the only one who could figure this out." The mechanic glanced toward the aircraft. "What exactly is happening?" he asked. The technician began explaining the problem in detail. A strange vibration appeared during certain flight conditions. The engineers had replaced several parts, but the vibration kept returning. The mechanic walked slowly toward the helicopter. He ran his hand gently along the metal surface before kneeling near one of the access panels. Tools were brought to him, and he began examining the system carefully. Engineers gathered nearby, watching quietly. His movements were calm and focused, the same way he had once worked inside the garage. After nearly an hour of careful inspection, the mechanic finally leaned back slightly. "I think I see the problem," he said. Several engineers leaned closer. The mechanic explained that the vibration was not coming from the part they had replaced. Instead, it was being caused by a tiny misalignment deeper inside the system. "It's small," he said, "but when the engine reaches certain speeds, the pressure changes." He showed them exactly where to look. The engineers quickly began checking the area he indicated. Within minutes, one of them looked up in surprise. "You're right," the engineer said. The misalignment was almost impossible to notice without knowing exactly where to look. The senior technician smiled broadly. "I told you," he said to the others. The repair process began immediately. Parts were adjusted carefully while the mechanic guided them step by step. By the afternoon, the system was finally ready for testing. The helicopter's engine started with a deep roar inside the hangar. Everyone watched the monitors closely. The vibration readings remained perfectly stable. The engineers exchanged relieved smiles. The problem had finally been solved. The senior technician turned to the mechanic with clear admiration. "You saved us weeks of work," he said. The Navy officer standing nearby nodded respectfully. For them, the quiet man who had arrived from a small town was not just a mechanic. He was someone with rare knowledge and experience. But the mechanic simply wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at the clock. "My child will be getting out of school soon," he said calmly. The officers exchanged quick glances. The senior officer smiled. "Then we should get you home." As the sun began lowering in the sky, the helicopter prepared for another flight. This time, however, the crew members looked at the mechanic very differently. The man who had been fired from a small garage a day before had just solved a problem that an entire team of engineers could not fix. And back in town, People were about to witness something that would leave them completely speechless. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky when the helicopter lifted off again from the military base. The powerful blades cut through the air as the aircraft slowly rose above the hangars and runways. Inside the cabin, the mechanic sat quietly near the window. The officers across from him were speaking softly with one another, reviewing notes about the repair that had just been completed. The mood inside the helicopter felt lighter now. The problem that had caused so much concern earlier in the day had finally been solved. The mechanic looked out the window as the landscape moved beneath them. Fields, roads, and small towns passed by one after another. For a moment, it almost felt like stepping into a life he had left many years ago. But his thoughts quickly returned to something more important. His child would be leaving school soon. He checked the time again. One of the officers noticed and smiled slightly. "Don't worry," the officer said. "We'll have you home in plenty of time." The mechanic nodded politely. "I appreciate that." After a short pause, another officer leaned forward. "You handled that situation today better than most engineers we know," he said honestly. The mechanic gave a small shrug. "It was just experience," he replied. The officer shook his head. "Experience like that is rare." For a few moments, the cabin grew quiet again, except for the steady hum of the helicopter. Far below them, the mechanic could see his town slowly appearing in the distance. Small buildings, narrow roads, and the open field where the helicopter had landed earlier that morning. As the aircraft came closer, the pilot guided it toward the same open field beside the road near the repair garage. People in the area had already begun noticing the helicopter returning. Workers at the garage heard the familiar roaring sound and stepped outside again. One mechanic shaded his eyes as he looked toward the sky. "Is that the same helicopter from this morning?" he asked. Another worker nodded slowly. "Looks like it." Inside the garage, the owner also heard the noise. He walked outside with a curious expression. When he saw the helicopter circling above the field again, he felt a strange sense of uneasiness. Moments later, the aircraft descended toward the ground. Dust and dry grass lifted into the air as the helicopter landed. Several people gathered along the roadside, watching with curiosity. The garage workers stood near the entrance, whispering among themselves. The helicopter door slowly opened. At first, 2 Navy officers stepped out. Then another figure appeared behind them. The workers stared in confusion as the man stepped down onto the ground. It was the same mechanic who had been fired the day before. For a moment, nobody spoke. The owner's face stiffened as he recognized him. But something looked very different now. The officers standing beside the mechanic treated him with clear respect. One of them even stepped slightly aside, allowing him to walk forward first. The mechanic walked calmly across the field toward the road. His movements were quiet and natural, just like they had always been. But the situation around him had completely changed. One of the officers turned toward the small group of workers and spoke politely. "We wanted to thank him properly before bringing him home," the officer said. The workers exchanged confused glances. The owner cleared his throat. "Thank him for what?" he asked. The officer looked at him calmly. "For helping us solve a serious mechanical problem with one of our aircraft." The owner blinked. "Our engineers have been trying to fix it for weeks," the officer continued. "He located the issue in less than an hour." The workers stared at the mechanic with wide eyes. The same quiet man who had spent years repairing cars in their garage had apparently just helped the Navy repair a helicopter. One younger mechanic whispered softly, "I didn't even know he worked on aircraft." Another shook his head slowly. "Neither did I." The officer continued speaking. "His knowledge and experience saved us a great deal of time today," he said respectfully. He then turned toward the mechanic. "We're grateful for your help." The mechanic simply nodded. "It was no trouble." The officer smiled slightly. "That's not what our engineering team said." The owner of the garage stood silently during the entire conversation. His mind was racing. Only yesterday he had shouted at this man in front of everyone and fired him without hesitation. Now the Navy was standing beside him, thanking him for solving a problem their own engineers could not fix. The realization made the owner feel deeply uncomfortable. The mechanic glanced briefly toward the garage but did not say anything. One of the officers stepped closer to him. "We would like to speak with you again soon, The officer said quietly, "There may be future opportunities where your skills could help us." The mechanic listened carefully but did not respond immediately. His focus remained on something else. He checked the time again. "My child will be leaving school soon," he said. The officer smiled understandingly. "Of course." The helicopter crew began preparing for departure again. Before returning to the aircraft, the officer turned back once more. "Thank you again," he said sincerely. The mechanic nodded politely. Then the officers walked back toward the helicopter. Within moments, the powerful blades began spinning once more. The aircraft lifted slowly into the sky, leaving behind a cloud of dust that drifted across the field. As the helicopter disappeared into the distance, the town slowly returned to its normal quiet rhythm, but the workers at the garage were still standing in stunned silence. The younger mechanic finally spoke. "Why didn't he ever tell us about that?" he asked. Another worker shrugged. He never talked about himself much. The owner looked down at the ground. Regret began to settle heavily on his shoulders. He remembered the harsh words he had spoken the day before, the humiliation, the way he had ordered the mechanic to pack his tools and leave. Now the entire situation looked very different. The owner slowly walked toward the mechanic, who was standing calmly near the road. For a moment, the owner struggled to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't realize," he said awkwardly. The mechanic looked at him quietly. The owner shifted uncomfortably. "What happened yesterday? Maybe I was too quick to judge." The mechanic did not interrupt. The owner took a deep breath. "If you want your job back, you can return tomorrow," he said. "We could really use someone with your experience." The workers nearby listened carefully. Everyone wondered what the mechanic would say. The quiet man looked toward the garage building for a moment. It was a place where he had spent many years working long hours. Then he looked back at the owner. His voice remained calm and steady. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I think it's time for something different." The owner nodded slowly. He understood what that meant. The mechanic then picked up his toolbox and began walking down the road toward home. The workers watched him leave. None of them spoke. The same man they had seen humiliated just a day earlier had now walked away with quiet dignity. And somehow, without raising his voice or seeking attention, he had shown everyone in that garage exactly who he truly was. The road home felt quieter than usual that afternoon. The mechanic carried his toolbox in one hand while walking slowly along the sidewalk. The events of the day still felt strange, almost unreal. Just yesterday, he had walked away from the garage feeling humiliated and uncertain about the future. Today, he had helped prepare a military aircraft and flown across the region in a Navy helicopter. But none of that mattered as much as the simple routine waiting for him. He checked the time again and quickened his steps. School would be ending soon. When he reached the school gate, several parents were already standing nearby, waiting for their children. The mechanic leaned against the fence quietly, watching students run across the playground as the final bell rang. Within minutes, the doors opened, and children began pouring out in groups. The child spotted him almost immediately and ran toward him with a big smile. "You're here," the child said happily. "Of course," he replied with a warm smile. They began walking home together. The child talked excitedly about the drawing project from earlier that day and proudly showed a piece of paper filled with bright colors. The mechanic listened carefully, asking questions and smiling. The child never noticed anything unusual. To them, it was just another normal afternoon. When they reached home, the mechanic placed his toolbox near the door again and started preparing dinner. The house soon filled with the familiar sounds of cooking and the quiet chatter of the child explaining stories from school. For the first time since losing his job, the mechanic felt calm again. Later that evening, after homework was finished and dinner dishes were cleaned, the child sat on the living room floor, drawing more pictures while the mechanic fixed a small broken chair. The simple moment reminded him why he had chosen this life years ago. Raising his child had always been more important than any job title. But the day was not quite over yet. Just as the sun disappeared behind the houses, a car slowly pulled up in front of the small home. The mechanic noticed the headlights through the window. A moment later, someone knocked on the door. He opened it to see one of the Navy officers standing outside. The officer greeted him politely. "Sorry to visit again," the officer said. I hope we're not interrupting anything. The mechanic shook his head. No, everything is fine. The officer stepped inside and looked around the modest house. For a moment, the child looked up curiously from the drawings on the floor. The officer smiled kindly and waved. Then he turned back to the mechanic. I wanted to speak with you about something important, he said. They sat down at the small kitchen table. The officer placed a folder on the table and opened it. Today's repair confirmed something we already suspected, he explained. The mechanic listened quietly. You have a rare level of experience with complex aircraft systems, the officer continued. Skills like that are difficult to find. The mechanic folded his hands on the table. I haven't worked in that field for a long time, he said. The officer nodded. That may be true, but your ability today showed that the knowledge is still very much there. He slid a document across the table. We'd like to offer you a position as a technical advisor for our aviation maintenance team. The mechanic looked down at the paper. The officer continued explaining. It wouldn't require you to move away from your home. Most of the work would involve visiting facilities when special issues appear. The rest could be done remotely. The mechanic remained silent for a moment, thinking carefully. The officer added one more thing, and the schedule would allow you to continue taking care of your child. That detail made the mechanic look up. The officer smiled. We made sure of it. The mechanic thought about the garage again. The long hours, the shouting, the way everything had ended. Then he thought about the work he had done earlier that day. The challenge, the problem solving, the quiet satisfaction of fixing something complex. Most of all, he thought about the future he wanted to build for his child. After a few seconds, he spoke. I would like to try. The officer's expression brightened. I'm very glad to hear that. They shook hands across the table. From the living room, the child looked up curiously. Are you getting a new job? The child asked. The mechanic smiled. Yes, he said gently. What kind? He thought for a moment before answering. I'll be helping people fix big flying machines. The child's eyes widened with excitement. Like helicopters? The mechanic laughed softly. Yes, something like that. Over the next few weeks, life slowly began changing. The mechanic started working with the Navy team as a technical advisor. Sometimes he traveled to different facilities for inspections or special repairs. Other days, he worked from home reviewing reports and helping engineers solve difficult problems. Despite the new responsibilities, he never missed school pickups or family dinners. The balance he had always wanted finally became possible. Word about what had happened also spread quietly around town. People who had once only known him as the quiet mechanic began looking at him with new respect. At the garage, the workers often talked about the day the Navy helicopter had landed. The owner rarely joined those conversations. Every time he remembered the moment he had fired the mechanic, a feeling of regret returned. One afternoon, several weeks later, a small convoy of vehicles passed through town. Among them was a military helicopter flying overhead. It did not land this time, but some of the workers at the garage stepped outside to watch it pass. One of the younger mechanics spoke quietly. You know, he never argued with anyone here, he said. Another worker nodded. He just did his job. The owner stood in the doorway, watching the helicopter disappear into the distance. Sometimes the most capable people are also the quietest ones, and sometimes it takes losing someone to realize their true value. Meanwhile, at the small house on the other side of town, the mechanic was sitting at the table helping his child with homework. The evening air was calm, and the house was filled with quiet laughter. For him, success was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about building a peaceful life for the person who mattered most. And in the end, the man who had once been humiliated and fired had gained something far more important than a job. He had gained respect, purpose, and a future that no one could take away.